Hello, guys. It has been a hot minute. I am sorry for how long it has taken me to get back into reading Magic's Pawn. New comments have been asking, is this series going to get finished? Where are you? I want to read more. Where are you? It just hasn't been the right time. So being stuck inside during this time of isolation. 2020, we know what's going on. If it's later than 2020, it was a very boring time. So, how about we read a book? I am sorry, because it has been so long, I am very, very sorry for any discrepancies I may have between other chapters and this chapter. This is chapter 9. So, as you can probably tell from the title card and thumbnail, I have a little bit different setup, a little bit different app, so bear with me. Still figuring it out. It's been a long time since I've made a video, so it's gonna take some time for me to refigure out how to use all the software. So without further ado, let us read Mercedes Lackey, Book 1 of the Last Herald Mage Trilogy, Magic's Pawn. Chapter 9. Vaniel stumbled through the pouring, frigid rain. He was half blinded with grief, with no hope of finding comfort anywhere in this world. There was nothing left for him. Nothing. He's dead. Oh, gods, he's dead, and it's all my fault. His whole body seemed to be on fire, a slow, smoldering pain that was burning away at him from the inside the way the ice of his dream had chilled him. There was no reason to fight ice or fire anymore. Let either or both eat him. He couldn't care. Rain pounded him. Hail struck like slung stones. His head reeled and pounded with his pulse. He hurt, but he welcomed the pain. It's all I deserve. It was all my fault. He couldn't see where he was going, and he didn't give a damn. He tripped and fell any number of times, but bruises and cuts didn't matter. He just picked himself back up and kept running in whatever direction he happened to be facing. His whole universe had collapsed the moment Tylendale had thrown himself off that tower. Somewhere down in the depths of his soul was the dim thought that if he ran far enough, ran fast enough, he might run off the edge of the world and into an oblivion where there would be no more feeling and no more pain. He didn't run off the edge of the world, quite. He ran off the bank into the river. The ground just disappeared under his feet, and he flailed his arms wildly as he half fell, half tumbled down the bank, and somersaulted at the bottom into the icy water. It closed over his head, and the cold shocked him into an instant of forgetfulness. He lost the desire for oblivion as instinct took over, and he fought back up to the surface. He gulped air, shook water out of his eyes, and in a flash of lightning saw an oncoming tree limb too late to dodge it. He managed to turn away from it, but it hit him across the back of the head and knocked him under again. The second time his head broke the surface, he was dazed and unthinking. In another glare of lightning, he saw the branches of a bush beside him and grabbed at them. They were too far away, far out of his frantic reach. Then the bush shook violently and seemed to stretch toward him. He snatched at the ends of the branches. He caught them, somehow. They cut into his hand, but he managed to pull himself into the shallows. He had just enough strength left to crawl halfway up into the rain-slick bank, and just enough mind left to wonder why he'd bothered to save himself. He lay face down in the sodden dead grass on the bank, chilled and numb, and growing colder, and racked with anguished guilt and warning. Lendl, it was all my fault. Oh, gods, it was all my fault. I should have told Seville. I should have tried to stop you. He sobbed into the rough grass, the damp-smelling earth, longing inarticulately for the power of a god to reverse time, to unmake all that had happened. I'm sorry. Oh, please, someone take it all back. If you have to have someone take me instead, make it a dream. Oh, gods, please. But it wasn't a dream, no more than the rain that was diluting his tears, or the icy water that tugged at his legs. And no god intervened to unmake the past. The wintry cold was closing in on him, chilling the fire along his veins. He was too weak to move, and too tired, and far too grief-stricken to care. It occurred to him that then he might die here, as alone as Tylendel had died. It was no less than his deserts, and he changed his prayers. Please, he asked desperately of powers that were not answering. Please, let me die. He thought of every mistake he had made, every wrong turning, and moaned, I deserve to die. He thought in anguish, closing his eyes, I want to die. No. The mind voice was bright, bright as flame, and sharp as steel, piercing his dark hope for death. No, you must not. You must live, chosen. He raised his head a little, but couldn't get his eyes open, and really didn't want to. You don't know. He thought bleakly back at the intruder. Let me alone. No one wants me. No one should ever want me. I kill everything I care for. But someone grabbed him by the back of the collar and half dragged him up the bank. He tried to twist away, but his body wouldn't work right anymore, and all he did was thrash feebly. Heartbeats later, the rain was no longer pounding his back, and the green-smelling soft moss under his weakly moving hands was dry. He'd been pulled into some kind of shelter. Whatever had him let go of his collar, after lowering him gently onto the moss. He managed to get his eyes open, but with the lightning fading off into the distance, he could see nothing but darkness. Something warm and large lay down beside him with a sigh. A soft nose nuzzled his cheek, like Galahad. The sensation brought up memories that cut him into little shreds. He brought his knees up under his chest and curled up on himself, sobbing uncontrollably, driven to the edge of sanity by grief and loneliness. But I am here. He brought his head up a little, and looked for the speaker with vision blurred by tears. In a last glare of the lightning met a pair of glowing sapphire eyes, eyes so full of compassion and love that he knew their owner would forgive him anything. That love reached out for him, and flowed over into him. It couldn't erase his loss, but it could share the pain. It didn't blame him for what happened. He uncurled and groped for the smooth white neck and shoulder, the way he had seized onto the branches of the bush to keep from drowning. He sobbed himself into exhaustion on that shoulder, wept until he hadn't the strength to shed another tear, and into a kind of fevered half-sleep. And all the while that bright verse murmured, like a litany, over and over into his mind. I am here, my chosen. I love you, and I will never leave you. Seville, we found him. Marduk burst into the room that had been Vaniel's and Tylendel's, dripping from head to toe, and shivering in the draught from the door behind him. As he turned to close the door, Seville dredged up energy she hadn't dreamed she still possessed, and started to rise. Jason and healer Andrel simultaneously seized her shoulders and pushed her back down into her chair. Where? She demanded in a voice hoarsened by weeping. Who found him? Is he all right? I don't know. The companions found him. Yfandes did, anyway. Marduk replied vaguely, swaying with weariness, looking colorless with exhaustion in the yellow candle light. She found him in the garden side of this river and dragged him into a grotto. Tantris thinks he's sick, something like backlash, but he can't tell for sure. He's trying to persuade her to let him bring Van back here so Andrel can take care of him. So Seville shook her head. trying to make sense of his words. Marduk, what are you trying to tell me? What has Yofandes got to do with anything? She wouldn't let anyone lay a finger on him, Seville, Marduk replied, blinking, and still shivering despite the warmth of the room. She's adamant about it. The man damn near took Tantra's hand off when he tried to get at Van. She told my Fortin that she doesn't trust us to protect him and keep him under shield properly. That we won't understand what we've got. That he's hurt, all torn up inside his mind, and we can't begin to help him. Marduk, Jason said slowly, are you saying that Yofandes chose Vaniel, the only full-grown companion in the field that hasn't chosen, the companion that hasn't chosen for over 10 years, and now she's chosen Vaniel? She didn't come out and say so, but I guess she did, Marduk said, fatigue slurring his words as he slumped against the doorframe. I don't know why in hell she'd be curled up around him like he was her fault otherwise, and not letting us near him. We think he's unconscious, he isn't moving, and he isn't responding when we talk to him. But Yofandes won't let anyone close enough to get a good look at him. Seville exchanged startled looks with the Seneschal's herald, but it was Healer Andrel who put their thoughts into words. By Lady Bright, he murmured, green eyes gone round with consternation. What in havens is this going to mean? Vaniel swam out of a feverish, fitful nightmare, prodded by an insistent voice in his head. He moaned and opened dry, hot eyes that ached and burned. His head still pounded, and moving it even a little made his vision blur. He felt as if his whole body was a hot, tight, painfully constrictive garment. It felt like it didn't belong to him. Sunlight gleamed weakly in through a rocky opening. He could see the river gurgling by just a few paces beyond it. It looked as if he were in a cave, but there were pink marble benches beside the entrance. Caves didn't have pink marble benches. They didn't have cultivated, moss-covered floors either. Then he recognized the place for what it was, one of the garden grottos set into the riverbank. They were popular with courting couples or people seeking a moment of solitude from the court. Tylendal had often wistfully expressed the wish that they dared to use one. Tylendal. Grief closed around his throat and stopped his breath. No, Vaniel. Chosen. Not now. Mourn later. Now get up. Without knowing quite how he had gotten there, Vaniel found himself on his feet, leaving heavily on the silky shoulder of a companion. His companion. Yofandes. He tried to make sense of that, but his head spun too much and he couldn't get a good grip on any of the thoughts that half-formed and then blew away. You are ill, said the worried voice inside his mind. I cannot care for you. I did not wish to let you away from my protection, but I cannot help you. You have a fever. You need a healer. Move your foot. One step. Another. He discovered that he was shaking, and clung a little tighter to the companion's back. Obedient to the voice in his head, he put one hesitant foot in front of the other, learning quickly that he had to rest most of his weight on the arm clinging to Yofandes' shoulder. He had to close his eyes after the first couple of steps, and trust her to guide him. He was so dizzy and nauseated he couldn't make sense out of what he was seeing. They emerged into sunlight that was far too much for his eyes. He opened them once, and shut them again, quickly. The companion suddenly stepped away from him, and he literally fell into the arms of a strange herald. Once out of contact with Yofandes, there were dozens of voices in his head, all of them clamorous, all of them confusing. He whimpered, tried to pull away, and hid his head in his arms. They hurt. They hurt. And he couldn't make out which ones were his own thoughts and which belonged to someone else. Tell your damned chosen to shield him, Dalian. That voice he recognized, although Yofandes had never spoken that sharply to him. The stranger bit off a curse and touched Vaniel's forehead, and the voices cut off. Vaniel opened his eyes again, and he wished he hadn't. The world was spinning around him as the center of chaos. He shut them immediately, vowing not to reopen them. "Let me, Tantris." The soft voice was that of yet another stranger. Two cool hands rested lightly on his head, and brought with them the promise of comfort and the peace of sleep. He took what they offered, falling into an oblivion gratefully. With any luck, he'd never wake up. The bed looked far too big for the boy. Never tall, he seemed to have collapsed in on himself. He was as pale as the sheets, and it might have been his dark hair and naturally fair complexion, but it seemed to her that he looked worse than Tylendale had after his fit. That was something Seville had not thought possible until now. "Tylendale, oh, my Lendl, my poor, poor Lendl." Unshed tears made a hard knot in her throat and misted her eyes, so she missed the moment that Andrel took his hand away from the boy's forehead and sagged back into his chair with a sigh of weariness, his graying red hair damp with sweat, his freckles twice as evident with his skin so washed out and pale. It was that sigh that brought her back to the urgent present. "Andrel," she said softly, "can you tell me anything?" "I did what I could for him, and more. I've got a line established." The green-robed healer to the heralds replied without looking up. "I want you to follow it, or, if you feel you can't, find me a herald mage your equal. I don't believe what I saw, and to be frank, I want a confirmation." Seville tightened her jaw, and told herself again that none of this had been Vaniel's fault. Besides, she was the only herald mage at the palace who was likely to have any feelings of charity towards the boy. "I'll follow it. Have you got more to say, or I want you in there first? What I have to say is going to depend on whether you think I've gone over the edge or not." Seville raised one eyebrow in surprise, but moved in to stand beside the healer. She reached out for Andrel's soothing presence as easily as she could have reached for his hand. They'd been lovers, once, and had worked together often, both before and since. They meshed auras exactly as a hand would close on hand, and Seville followed the line that the healer had established down past the churning chaos of Vaniel's sleeping surface mind to the dark, grief-stricken core of him. The measure of that grief would have reconciled her to him, even had she felt him blameworthy. She'd known the depth of Tylendale's feelings, but it seemed as if Vaniel's had run at least as deep. Certainly his grief and loss were as profound as her own. More. Oh gods, it's just what I had warned Lendl against. He's lost. He was utterly lost without Lendl. But that was not what brought her back onto her heels with real shock. Seville had spent most of the past 20 years of her life as the one herald mage most intimately involved with the training of young herald mages, and the one most often set to identify youngsters with active gifts and the potential of being chosen. She had seen children with 1, 2, or most commonly, no gifts. Tylendale had been unusual in having mind speech, fetching, empathy, and the mage gift, all at near equal strength. Most heralds or herald mages had 1 or 2 strong gifts, and few had as many as 3. Vaniel had them all. Each channel she tested, with the sole exception of healing, was open. Most of them had been forced open to their widest extent. The boy had mind speech, fetching, farsight, foresight, as much empathy as Tylendale had shown, and enough fire starting to ensure he'd never need to use the tinderbox again, and the all-important mage gift. His mind speech was even of both types, thought-sensing and projecting. And, irony of ironies, as if the gods were taking with one hand and offering a pittance as compensation, the bardic gift. This boy had more gifts than any 5 full heralds, and all of them had come into full activity in less than a day. To her horror, she could see that all the channels were as raw and sensitive as so many open wounds. The channels had not been opened. They'd been blasted open. It was a wonder the boy wasn't mad with the pain alone. Seville came up out of Vaniel's mind with a rush like a startled fish jumping out of a stream, and looked from the boy to the healer and back in a state of surprise that closely resembled shock. "Great good gods," she said. "What in the hell happened to do that?" Andrew shook his head. "Your guess would be better than mine. I never cared much from where powers came from. I was just concerned with learning to use them effectively. But do you see what I'm up against with this boy?" "I think so," Seville replied, groping for the bedpost and sitting down carefully at the foot of the bed. "Let me add this up. You've got backlash trauma from when the gate energy got pulled into him, and more trauma from when we sent it back into him. You've got the problems inherent when you wake the gifts late or early. You've got the problems with them being at full power from the moment they woke. Worst of all, you've got channels that were burned open or torn open instead of opening themselves. That and the more mundane emotional trauma and physical shock. I hope to the Havens that he doesn't come down with pneumonia on top of it all. I already fought off one fever, one his own body produced when it couldn't handle the energy overload." Andal touched the back of his hand to the boy's waxen cheek, checking his temperature. "So far, so good. But it's a real possibility. And I'm fighting off the effects of exposure, too. Seville, this child is a mess." "Lover, you have a talent for understatement." Seville contemplated Vaniel's pinched, grief-twisted face. "Even in sleep, he doesn't lose his pain." "Now I see why Yvonne was so reluctant to let him out of her care. Until she gets him firmly bonded to her, he's going to have to be in physical contact with her for her to protect him. But what can we do? I can't fit her in here, and I can't put him in the stables, not with the weather being what it is." "Try, and I'll call you up on charges," Andrew replied, and Seville could tell that he was not joking. "Do that in this chill and you'll kill him. It's going to be touchy enough with him tucked up in a warm bed." "Well, how in hell do I protect him from his own powers?" "Put your own shields on him, and hope nothing gets through." "I can't keep them up forever," Seville reminded him acidly. "I'm fairly well fagged out myself. A couple of hours, and it's about all I can manage at this point." "Then go order 2 graves, damn it," the healer snarled in sudden frustration, "because you're going to lose this one, too, if you don't do everything right with him." Seville pulled back, taken very much aback by the sudden explosion of temper. She faltered. Then as his words penetrated, and she thought of what was lying in the Grove Temple at this moment, lost her own precarious hold on calm. She got up, stumbling a little, turned away from him and leaned against the door frame, her shoulders shaking with her silent weeping. Seville. Strong but trembling hands on her shoulders turned her back to face the room, and pulled her into an embrace against a bony chest covered in soft green wool. "Seville, I'm sorry." Andrew muttered into her hair. "I shouldn't have said that. You're exhausted. I'm exhausted, and neither of us are up to facing the problem this boy represents. Is there anyone you can turn him over to for a day, at least, long enough for you to get some rest and a chance to think?" A white square of linen appeared just when she needed it. She mopped at her eyes with the handkerchief he offered, and blew her nose. "Under any other circumstances, I'd just let any of the others spell me. But I don't know, Andy. A lot of them still think he was responsible for all of this. Even if they shield with gifts like his, what is he going to pick up? You of all people should know how leaky we are to a new, raw gift, even when we aren't stressed." Andrew sighed. "Dear heart, I don't think you have a real choice. You'll just have to hope that if surface thoughts leak past, he won't be able to understand them yet. And if you don't get some rest, you're going to collapse. Even a novice healer would be able to tell you that." She bowed her head, feeling the weight of all her years and her sorrows falling on her back. "All right," she said, acting against her own better judgment, but unable to see any other option open to her. "See if you can round up Tantris for me, will you? At least he didn't know poor Lendl all that well." Vaniel woke from a dream in which Tylendel was alive again, and teased him gently about how much he had been grieving. For a confused moment after waking, he wasn't certain which had been the dream, and which the reality. Then he opened his eyes, and found that he was in his own bed, in his own room, now illuminated by carefully shaded candle lanterns, and there was something odd about the room. After a long moment, he finally figured out what it was. The feeling of Tylendel, the sense of his being there even when he wasn't physically present, was missing. That told him. He swallowed a moan of despair and closed his eyes against the resurgence of tears, and just in time, for the door opened softly and closed again, and he felt a new presence in the room with him. He froze for a moment, then sighed, as if in sleep, and turned on to his side, hiding his face away from the light. He was hearing things, like someone talking to himself, only inside his head, the way Yvonne's voice had been inside his head. It hurt to listen, but he couldn't stop the words from coming in, and from the feel of that mind voice he knew who it was that was sitting by his bedside too. It was one of the heralds that had been with Seville, the one called Jason. And Jason did not in the least care for Vaniel. "Gods," Vaniel heard, a little garbled by the pain that came with the words. "Trade this arrogant little toad for Tylendel. Damn poor bargain." Vaniel could feel brooding eyes on him, and the words in his head came clearer, more focused. "No matter what Seville said, I'll never believe he didn't have something to do with the boy's death. They'd been all that close. Tylendel would have listened. And even if Lendl was crazed on revenge, this one wasn't. Lendl may have loved him, but he could never have cared for the lad in the same way, or he'd have stopped him. Lendl was just one more little addition to his stable of admirers. If he'd left Lendl alone, it hadn't played on his weakness." Vaniel cringed beneath the pitiless words, and the vision of himself that came with them. Arrogant, self-centered, self-serving, using Tylendel, not caring for him, and worse than that, feeding him what he craved, like feeding a perpetual drunk the liquor he shouldn't have. Without thinking about it, he reached beyond his room. It was a little like straining his ears to hear a conversation in the distance, and the pain that came with the effort felt like muscles pulling against a broken bone. But he found he could catch other snatches of, it must be thoughts, that touched him. They could have been the echoes of Jason's thoughts. He pulled his awareness back, as a child pulls its singed hand from a fire that has burned it, and there were only two creatures in all the world that he could be certain cared for him despite what he was: Tylendel and Euphondes. Neither were to be trusted to know the truth about him. The second was besotted by whatever magic had made her choose him, and the first was dead. And it was his fault. Jason was right. If he'd really cared for Lendl, he'd have stopped him. It wouldn't even have been hard. If he hadn't agreed to get those books, if he hadn't agreed to help him with that spell, Tylendel would be alive at this moment. And if he hadn't seduced Lendl with his own needs, none of this would ever have happened. Bad on top of worst, now he was a burden on the heralds, who hated him, but felt honor-bound to take him in Tylendel's place. He could never, ever replace Tylendel. Not ever. Even when he knew that. He had none of Tylendel's virtues and all of his vices and more. He'd listen to the mind voice of the one beside him with all his strength, ignoring the pain it cost, hoping beyond hope that the herald would somehow give him the chance to get away, Get away and do something to make this right. If the herald would just go away for a moment, or better yet, fall asleep. Jason was tired. Though he'd done less magic than Seville and had more time to rest, he was still very weary. He'd set himself up in the room's really comfortable chair, the one Tylendale had sometimes fallen asleep in. Vaniel could feel Jason's mind drifting over into slumber, and held his breath, hoping he'd drift all the way. Because he'd gleaned something else from those minds out there. Because the death bell had rung for him, despite what he'd done. Tylendale was being accounted a full herald, and tomorrow would be buried with all the honors. Tomorrow, but tonight, he was in the temple in the grove. And if he could get that far, Vanna was going to try and right the wrongs he had done to all of them, atoning with the only thing he had left to give. Jason's thoughts slipped into the vague mumbles of sleep, and the next moment a gentle snore from the chair beside the bed told Vaniel that he was completely gone. Vaniel turned over, deliberately making some noise. Jason continued to snore, undisturbed. Vaniel sat up, slowly taking stock of himself and his surroundings. About a candle mark later, he was dressed. Even if he had not needed to move slowly for fear of waking the herald, he would have had to for weakness. He had even needed to hold on to the furniture at first, because his legs were so unsteady. Even now his legs trembled with every step he took, but at least he was moving a bit more surely. He stole soundlessly across the floor, and unlatched the door, opened it just enough to squeeze himself through, and shut it again. It was dark out here, a still, cloudless night. He wouldn't be seen, but it was a long way to the grove. He steeled himself and stepped shakily onto the graveled path that ran from his door through the moonlit garden. But someone had been waiting for him. Euphondes glided out of the darkness to his side almost before he had made 5 steps along that path. "No," she said sternly, barring his way. "You are ill. You should be in bed." For a moment he was ready to collapse right where he stood. God, she's going to stop me. Then he saw a way to get Euphondes to help him, without her knowing she was doing so. Please. He directed everything he could on part of the truth. He couldn't lie mind to mind, he knew that. But he didn't have to reveal everything unless Euphondes should ask a direct question about it. And besides that, the link to her was fading in and out, and it hurt, like everything else. And he would bet she wouldn't want to force anything. "Please, Euphondes, I have to," he faltered, "just to say goodbye." She bowed her head almost to the earth as he let his grief pour out over her. "Very well," he heard, but the mind voice was heavy with reluctance. "I will help you, but you must rest after." "I will," he promised, meaning it, though not in the way she intended. She went to her knees so that he could mount. He, once the best rider at forced reach, could not drag himself onto her back without that help. His arms and legs trembled with weakness as he clung to her back, and if it had not been that she could balance a toddler there and not let it fall, he would have lost his seat within the first few moments. He concentrated on his weariness and how physically miserable he was feeling, and spent not so much as an eye blink on his real intentions. He closed his eyes, both to concentrate, and because seeing the ground move by so fast in the moonlight was making him nauseated and disoriented again. He had no notion of how fast the companions could travel at a so-called walk. She was stepping carefully up to the porch of Grove Temple long before he had expected her to get there. The clear ringing of her hooves on the marble surprised him into opening his eyes. "We are here," she said, and knelt for him to dismount. The marble of the temple porch glistened wetly in the moonlight, and he could see candlelight shining under the door. He slid from Euphondes' back and listened with this new mental ear for other minds within the temple. None. He shivered in the cold wind. He dressed carefully in the black silk tunic and breeches Tyrandel had thought he looked best in, and once off Euphanda's warm, broad back, the wind cut right through his clothing. Not for long, she admonished, as he clung to the door frame and negotiated unlatching the door into the temple itself. No, Euphandas, he said sincerely, not for long. He got the door open and closed again. Then, as quietly as he could, he locked it. There was no clamor from the opposite side, so he assumed she had not heard the door bolt shoot home. He turned, bracing himself for what he was about to do, and faced the altar. The temple itself was tiny, hardly bigger than the common room of their suite. It had been built all of white marble, within and without. The walls took up the candlelight and reflected it until they fairly glowed. There were only 2 benches in it, and the altar. Behind the altar were stands thick with candles. Behind the candles, the wall had been carved into a delicate bas-relief, swirling clouds, the moon, the stars, and the sun. And in the clouds, suggestions of male and female faces, whose expressions changed with the flickering of the candles. Before the altar stood the bier. Vaniel's legs trembled with every step. He made his way unsteadily to that white-draped platform and looked down on the occupant. They dressed Tyrandel in full whites. His eyes were closed, and there was no trace of his grief or his madness in that handsome, peaceful face. His hands were folded across his waist, those graceful, strong hands that had held so much comfort for his beloved. He looked almost exactly as if he had so many mornings when Vaniel had awakened first. His long, golden curls were spread against the white of the pallet. A few of them tumbled a little untidily over his right temple. Long, dark gold lashes lay against his cheeks. Only the pose was wrong. Tyrandel had never, in all the time Vaniel had known him, slept in anything other than a sprawl. Vaniel reached out, hesitantly, to touch that smooth cheek, almost believing even now that if he had only to touch him to awaken him. But the cheek was cold, as cold as the marble of the altar, and the eyes did not flutter open at his touch. This was no child's tale, and the sleeping one would wake again at the magic touch of the one who loved him. Please, Lendl, forgive me, he whispered to the quiet face, and took the knife from the white sheath on Tyrandel's belt. I'm going to try to pay for all of what I did to you. His hands shook, but his determination remained firm. Quickly, before he could lose courage, he bent and kissed the cold lips, hoping that this too would be forgiven, and caught in a grief too deep for tears. Then he knelt on the icy white marble of the floor beside the bier, and braced the hilt of the dagger between his knees, clasping his hands with the dagger between his wrists, resting them on either side of the blade edge. Lendl, there's nothing without you. Forgive me if you can, he whispered again, both to Tyrandel and the brooding faces behind the altar. And before he could begin to be afraid, he pulled both wrists up along the knife edges, slashing them simultaneously. The dagger was as sharp as he had hoped, sharper than he expected. He cut both wrists almost to the bone, gasped as pain shot up his arms, and the knife fell clattering to the marble, released when his legs jerked involuntarily. He sagged with sudden dizziness, and fell forward over his bent knees, his head bowed over his hands. His arms lying limp on the marble floor, blood began to spread on the white marble, pooled before him under his slashed wrists. He stared at it in morbid fascination. red on white, like blood on snow. It was only at that moment that Euphondis seemed to realize what he was doing. She screamed and began kicking at the door, but it was far too late. His eyes were no longer focusing properly anymore, and his wrists didn't even hurt. "I'm sorry," he thought muzzily at the frantic companion beginning to black out, and feeling himself falling over sideways. "Euphondis, I'm sorry. You'll find someone better than me, worthy of you." "Gone?" Seville's voice broke. "What in the hell do you mean, gone?" "Seville, I swear to you the boy was asleep. I dozed off for a breath or two, and when I woke up he was gone," Jason answered, one hand clutched at the side of his head, a fistful of hair, his expression gone frantic and guilt-ridden. "I thought maybe he'd gone to the privy or something, but I can't find him anywhere." Seville swung her legs out of bed and rubbed her eyes, trying to think. Where would Vaniel have gone? And in the name of God, why? But in a heartbeat she had her answer. The frightened, frantic scream of a companion rang across the river, and her Kellen's voice shrilled into her head. "Seville, the boy!" And an image of where he was and what he had done. From the stricken look on Jason's face, his own Phalar had just given him the same information. "Gods!" Seville snatched a cloak from the chair beside her bed, and ran out in her bare feet through the common room, and headed for the door of Vaniel's room. Jason's breathing down her neck. She hit the garden door at a dead run, and it was a damned good thing it wasn't locked, because if it had been, she'd have broken it off the hinges. The cold of the night slapped her in the face like an impious hand. That stopped her for a moment, but only a moment. And the next instant Phalar and Kellen pounded up at a gallop. Phalar skidded around in a tight pivot, presenting his hindquarters to his chosen, who leapfrogged into his seat with an acrobatic skill that would have had Seville muttering about show-offs, had the situation been less precarious. Instead, she waited for Kellen to come to a dead halt, and clambered onto her back anyhow, her bedgown rucked up around her legs. As Kellen launched herself into a full, frantic gallop, Seville clung on as best she could. Now Seville was a breath behind Jason, as the young Seneschal's herald led the way across the bridge and up to the fields of the Temple of the Grove. Nor were they the only two summoned by the frantic screaming, mind and voice of Euphondis. Heralds and trainees were boiling out of the palace like aroused fire ants, rendezvousing with their companions and heading across the river at breakneck speed. But Jason and Seville were the first two on the scene. It was their dubious privilege to see Euphondis trying to batter down the solid bronze door of the temple single-handedly, and not budging it by so much as a thumb's breadth. Her hooves were screeching across the metal, leaving showers of sparks in their wake, and her anguished screams were far too like a companion's for comfort, or far too like a human's for comfort. Jason vaulted off Phalar's back and hit the ground at a run, ducking fearlessly under Euphondis' hooves to make a trial of the door himself. "It's locked from the inside," he shouted unnecessarily as Seville slid from Kellen's back to limp to his side. He put his shoulder against the door and rammed it, with no more luck than Euphondis had had. "Vaniel!" Seville put her mouth up against the crack between the door and the frame, and shouted through it, "Van, lad, let us in!" She put her ear to the crack and listened, but heard nothing. "Kellen, Euphondis says she's still alive, but unconscious and weakening," came the grim reply as Euphondis danced in place, her sapphire eyes gone nearly black with anguish. "Somebody get me a mage light on that damned tower!" It was Marduk. He had his hands on Donnie's shoulders and was staring up at the tower. Donnie was holding a crossbow with a bulky missile cocked and ready. Seville responded first, running far back enough from the door that she could see the top of the bell tower. It was glowing faintly, but obviously not too faintly for Donnie to make out a target. Seville raised her hands and sent up such a burst of power that the entire top of the tower flowered with light. While Marduk closed his eyes and scowled in concentration, Donnie raised the crossbow, squinted carefully along it, and fired. The oddly shaped arrow flew strangely and slowly, trailing something light-colored behind it. In a moment, Seville realized why and what it was. Donnie had been a bright little apprentice thief when she'd been chosen. This was a grapnel arrow, meant to carry a light but strong line through an open window and catch on the sill. Marduk had a very weak but usable fetching gift. He had invoked it to help the arrow carry something heavier than a light line, a climbing rope. It lobbed through the loop of the bell house, clanging ominously off the death bell itself. Seville felt a chill and made a warning gesture, nor was she the only one. She could see most of the others shivering at the least, and Euphondes moaned like a dying thing at the sound of the bell. Donnie, normally mobile, face gone blank, was paying no attention to anything other than her arrow and line. All of her concentration was on the task in her hand. She drew the rope to her with agonizing slowness. Seville fought down the urge to shout at her to hurry. Finally, Donnie's careful pulling met resistance. She tugged, then pulled harder, then yanked on the rope with all her might. Then, before Seville had time to blink, she was swarming up it like a squirrel. One or two of the trainees gave a ragged cheer. Donnie ignored them. She reached the opening and squeezed through, and Seville saw to her surprise that Marduk was following her. She'd been so intent on Donnie's progress that she missed seeing him altogether until he got into the glow of the mage light. Seville sprinted back for the door. The crowd there parted to let her through, and waited, tumbling with impatience with the rest. "Hang on, Seville," she heard Marduk's mind voice in broad send mode. "He's alive. Thank the gods he didn't know the right way to slit his wrists. Donnie's got the blood stopped, but we'll need a healer. Fast. Euphondes warped the door, pounding on it. It's going to take a bit of work to get it open." A tall figure in healer's greens pushed through to Seville's side as Marduk began pounding on the door, forcing the bolt back thumb length by thumb length. Andrew opened his arms and wrapped Seville inside the warmth of his fur-lined cloak with him. Finally the door creaked open. Andrew deserted her, leaving her suddenly in sole possession of the heavy cloak. She followed inside, hard on his heels. Donnie knelt in front of the bier. There was a frighteningly wide scarlet stain on the marble floor, and her hands looked as if she dipped them in vermilion dye. She was holding Vaniel's wrists. The boy was sprawled on the floor beside her at the foot of the bier, his face as transparently white as the marble under his head, and slackly unconscious. Andrew was just beginning to kneel in the pool of blood on the other side of the boy, heedless of his robes, and as Seville limped across the floor toward him, followed by the rest of the would-be rescuers, he reached out and set his hands firmly over Donnie's blood-stained ones. His face was fixed in a mask of absolute concentration, and Seville could feel the power beginning to flow from him. But he'd been hard-pressed today, and had little time to rest, and she knew that his few reserves were not going to be enough. She ran the last few steps and placed her hands on his shoulders, as he began to falter, sending energy coursing down into his center, and in a moment she felt herself joined by Jason, then Marduk, then Donnie. The four of them meshed in a union that was nearly as perfect as any magic she'd ever witnessed, and sent Andrew all he needed and more, in a steady, steadfast stream. Finally the healer sighed, and lifted his hands away from Donnie's. The other three disengaged with something that was a little like reluctance. It wasn't often that even heralds experienced the peace that came with a perfect healing meld. It was nearly a mystical experience, and as close to the peace of the havens as Seville ever wanted to get to until she was called. Donnie lifted her hands away from Vaniel's wrists, and Seville could see that the skin, veins, and tendons beneath were whole again. For a moment the wrists were marred by bright, angry red scars. Gradually those scars faded to thin, white lines. Jason moved swiftly to gather the unconscious boy in his arms. Blood from the boy's sleeves stained the front of his whites, but Jason didn't seem to notice. Vaniel's head sagged against the herald's chest. Despite being moved, he showed no signs of reviving. Seville helped Andrel to rise and go to him. The healer reached out a hand that shook uncontrollably and checked the pulse at the hinge of Vaniel's jaw, lifted an eyelid, then shook his head. Nearer than I like, and he lost too much blood, given what he's been through. Angel said, grimacing, Jays, can you and Phalar get him back into his bed as of a candle mark ago? No. Seville interrupted. No. You leave that to me and Euphondus. Jays, give him to me as soon as I get mounted. She pushed her way through the silent, shocked crowd and found Euphondus waiting as close to the open door as she could get. The companion looked deeply into Seville's eyes, her own eyes back to a quiet, depthless sapphire, then went to her knees for the herald to mount. Seville mounted, and Euphondus rose gracefully to her feet, not in the least unsteady on the smooth marble. Seville held out her arms, amazed by her own calm, and Jason lifted the limp form of Vaniel up into place before her. She cradled the boy against her shoulder, wrapping Angel's cloak around the both of them. He was no burden at all, really, almost too light a weight for the ease of her heart and conscience. Oh, lad, she sighed, nudging Euphondus lightly with her heels to tell her to go on. Poor little lad. We've made a right mess of your life, haven't we? And all for lack of listening to you. I don't know who's guiltier, me or Withen. She held him a bit tighter as Euphondus headed up a gentle walk towards the beckoning beacon of the open door of her suite. He was all the legacy Tylendel had left to her, and she pledged the silent sleeper in the temple behind her that she would take better care of him from this moment on. And the first task is to put you back together, my poor, bewildered, heartbroken lostling. If ever I can. So, that was Chapter 9 of Mercedes Lackey's, Book 1 of the Last Herald Mage Trilogy, Magic's Pawn, Chapter 9. Watch it. I'm going to start saying that in my sleep. I think I've done it before. That chapter was, it was a lot. When I'm editing this video in the future, I will make sure to put a warning down in the description box. If you don't like it, don't read it. I'll try to flash it up in the title card. And we'll see how long this takes me to edit. I will have to remember how to use all the software. But I haven't done a question of the day yet. Question of the day. Let's see. If you had a companion, what would their name be? I have thought of mine before. Mind you, I forgot it about 3 years ago. But I think I named her Marla? So yeah, what would your companion's name be? Write it down in the comments below. Be sure to like this video, subscribe if you feel like it, comment if you want to, and hey, have a good day. Stay safe, wash your hands, don't be stupid. Okay? Have a good day.